Welcome everyone to the ICNC webinar series. My name is Maciej Bartkowski. I'm Senior Advisor at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I'm delighted to host our guest speakers today, Ches Turber and Subindra Bogati, as well as the respondent, Veronique Didwe. Today's presentation is titled From the Hills to the Streets to the Table, Civil Resistance and Peace Building in Nepal. Ches and Subindra's talk will be based on the ICNC special report of the same title. And this special report can be downloaded for free from the ICNC website. So please use this opportunity to also access that great piece that we have available for you on the ICNC website. After ICNC published Veronique Didwe's report, Powering to Peace, Integrated Civil Resistance and Peace Building Strategies, and that also report can be downloaded for free from the ICNC website, we thought that her comprehensive analytical framework that integrates civil resistance and peace-building strategies could be further developed and further tested through in-depth case studies. So we have developed a call for proposals, and among many that we received, we have selected Subindra's and Chen's proposal on Nepal, in addition to the case study on Liberia. And we thought that Subindra's and Chen's proposal was very promising, and if delivered on what it promised, it could actually demonstrate very effectively the applicability of Veronique's framework to the analysis of interplay between civil resistance and peace-building strategies during a conflict. It could also show any possible gaps that this framework may have and areas for improvement. So I think what Ches and Subindra eventually delivered in the form of a special case study report that they will present on today does not disappoint in any respect. It's a highly valuable contribution that provides rich information about the conflict in Nepal and shows, I think, in a very compelling way how the analytical framework presented by Veronique and in her report can be used to describe accurately the interplay and impact of civil resistance and peace-building strategies on the dynamics and in a trajectory of conflict in a given country. So now I would like to briefly introduce our key speakers. Subindra Bogati is the founder and chief executive of Nepal Peacebuilding Initiative, an organization developed to evidence-based policy and action on peace-building and humanitarian issues. He has been working on conflict transformation issues and peace process in Nepal through various national and international organizations for the last several years. He holds an MA in International Relations from London Metropolitan University and was awarded the FCEO Achieving Fellowship in 2009 at the Center for Studies in Security and Diplomacy at the University of Birmingham. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science, Tribhuvan University, Nepal. Our second speaker is Dr. Ches Turber. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Northern Illinois University. His book, Between Mao and Gandhi, The Social Roots for Civil Resistance, will be published by Cambridge University later this year. The book investigates how social structures inform movements' willingness to engage in nonviolent and violent strategies. Dr. Turber's previous research has been published in International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Global Security Studies, Conflict Management, and Peace Science and Other Studies. He received his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And before I will ask Ches and Subindra to take over from me, I would like to remind our audience that we are live tweeting from the ICNC Twitter at Civil Resistance, and people can share their reactions using hashtag ICNC webinars. So now, Ches, Subindra, I would like to invite you to go ahead with your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maciej. It's great to be here and great to be able to share with everyone today the result of what's been a multi-year long project in writing this report. I also want to thank Bruce and the staff at ICNC for all of their help along the way through this process, as well as Dr. Veronique Didwe, both for her study that created the framework and the template for this project, as well as the really helpful guidance and feedback she gave to us through our research process. So I want to start with a little bit of context on the civil war that Nepal experienced between 1996 and 2006. So this first slide, it's got a lot of detail on it, but the big picture that I wanted to get across is kind of showing Nepal in the context of all of these civil wars that have occurred over the last 100 years or so around the world. And we see Nepal kind of in the middle. It was a conflict that, according to this chart, had 10,000 combatant fatalities. I think normally most scholars, when they write about Nepal's civil war, include civilian fatalities, and the number that's most frequently used is about 17,000 people that were killed in this civil war. But what's interesting about this civil war is that it was bookended by campaigns of civil resistance. In 1990, there was a civil resistance campaign that was known as the Jana Andolan, or the People's Movement, that was launched really at the time in which Nepal was governed by more or less an absolute monarchy. And this was a campaign to put some limits on the power of the king, to basically introduce democratic parliamentary governance to Nepal. And it succeeded in doing so. After this campaign, there are open political parties that campaign for elections to form a parliament, a government with a prime minister that's really calling the political shots in Nepal. The king is still around and has some powers. Nevertheless, despite this kind of transition to democracy, in 1996, the civil war begins by a group of Maoists operating in kind of the Midwestern Hill region of the country. That lasts 10 years, and it ends when the Maoists form an alliance with the political parties who, during the course of the civil war, supposedly as part of an effort to combat the insurgency, the palace, the king retook some of the political powers from the parliament. The political parties, now left out of the political process, therefore started negotiating with the Maoists, and they form an alliance to try to return Nepal to democratic governance, and for the Maoists to try to achieve some of their objectives as well. But tactically, what they decided to do was to use civil resistance as their strategy for coercing the king into making the political concessions that they want. That campaign was successful. In just a period of 19 days, they're able to get the king to basically blanket concede to everything they were asking for. And as part of the aftermath of that campaign, there is a comprehensive peace agreement between the political parties representing the government of Nepal and the Maoists that formally ends the civil war. So this process, we think, raises a number of interesting and puzzling questions. How was it that the armed Maoists, who had been fighting for 10 years, were convinced to transition to a primarily nonviolent strategy of civil resistance? How and why was that civil resistance campaign in 2006 successful, whereas violence previously had not been? And what accounts for the successes and failures of the subsequent peace process that has played out since 2006, and that has been driven by civil resistance and peace-building strategies? To help us answer these questions, we turn to the theoretical framework that Dr. Veronique Didwe spelled out in her ICNC special report a few years ago called Powering to Peace, Integrated Civil Resistance and Peace-Building Strategies. And one of the things that she notes in that report is that civil resistance and peace-building share a common commitment to this idea of creating social change, of addressing people's grievances through nonviolent means. However, they have kind of different theories and different kind of moral frameworks for thinking through fundamentally what the nature of conflict is and the ways in which you should try to resolve such conflicts. And so through the report, she identifies ways in which civil resistance and peace building can be strategies that complement each other. She spells this out over 4 stages of the course of a conflict's trajectory. This is a table from the report that kind of spells out more in detail the similarities and differences between the approaches of civil resistance and peace building in several different dimensions, in terms of the means and ends of conflict, in terms of their ethical orientation, the types of methods used, and who kind of the fundamental actors are. I'm going to mostly skip over this table for now because we have Dr. Didwe here today, and she'll be talking a little bit more about this. And so if you have questions, or if as she's talking, you want me to turn back to this table, I can do so. But instead, one of the key dimensions that I want to draw out for now, because it's going to inform how I present the case of Nepal going forward, is that Dr. Didwe draws on Adam Curley's 4 stages of conflict, dividing a conflict into a period of latent conflict, kind of where the grievances and the drivers of conflict swell up and develop. And in the case of Nepal, we identify this as the period between 1990 and 1996. A period of overt conflict in which actors are engaging in violent or non-violent strategies to try to achieve their goals. Then the period of conflict settlement, where the actors are involved in trying to come up with some type of formal agreement. And then the aftermath, the post-settlement period. So in Nepal, we think of the overt conflict period as mapping pretty well onto these 10 years of civil war, followed by the 19 days of civil resistance. And there's kind of a conflict settlement period both after the civil resistance campaign ends, leading up to the comprehensive peace agreement. But we extend it a couple years beyond that through a process, because they're kind of continued negotiations that go on that resolve issues such as the status of the monarchy, the means of electing what comes known as the Constituent Assembly, a body that's going to create a new constitution in Nepal. And then from 2008 onward, we identify that as the post-settlement period, where we identify what's worked and what hasn't worked in the aftermath of both the overt conflict and the conflict settlement. So phase 1, this period of latent conflict between 1990 and 1996. As I said, this period comes on the heels of a civil resistance campaign in 1990 that ushers in a period of democracy, of parliamentary constitutional monarchy. However, during this period of time, it wasn't new to this period of time, but what endures are high levels of structural inequalities in Nepali society among multiple different dimensions, whether it's social class, ethnicity. There are dozens of different ethnic groups with their own languages across the country of Nepal, religious differences, particularly between Hindus and Buddhists, but also there's a Muslim community in Nepal as well. Regional differences between those who live in the mountainous versus hill, and especially the plains region that borders India, and caste-based divisions as well. And so historically in Nepal, generally those who live in the Midwestern hill regions, who speak the dominant Nepali language, who are of higher caste, and who are of the Hindu religious faith, have enjoyed the majority of the political and economic benefits of Nepalese society. And even once we have this transition to democracy, it is people from these groups who are kind of dominating the political process. There's a kind of a famous quote from one activist who says, basically, yes, we had this transition to democracy, but all the same actors were involved. They just kind of changed the titles and the names of their titles on their doors. During this period of time, we see kind of a continuation of civil resistance strategies being used in the aftermath of the 1990 conflict. A lot of community organizing, a lot of civil society going on during this opening of democratic politics in Nepal. But a lot of the marginalized groups, especially, are met with repression when they're protesting and electioneering out in the country's periphery. In terms of peace-building strategies, there's not a lot of dialogue or violence prevention going on. By and large, both Nepali elites as well as outside actors in the country didn't really see Nepal as ripe for a conflict during this period of time. Didn't think that groups in the periphery that had grievances really presented much of a challenge. They wouldn't be able to engage in some type of conflict. They generally believed that they just had their transition to democracy. This was the solution to people's political issues and problems in Nepal. And so impact of this, the consequences, we had this period in which there was a spreading of the awareness of injustice in Nepali society. A lot more kind of the terminology of thinking about ethnic and caste-based differences, beginnings ability to mobilize on these shared grievances, but without kind of the peace-building strategies to really deal with them directly. And so hence we get this transition, especially in the rural communities, from latent to overt conflict. And so in interviews that I conducted before this project for my book, some quotes that really jumped out at me. This is a student wing leader of Maoist movement who says, "Nobody listens to the weak people's voice. This thought pointed me towards armed struggle." And another one who says, like, look, during this period of time, well, it's not that we turned to guns like fools. We didn't just rush into violence. During this period of time, we tried many of the nonviolent tactics that were available to us, but we found them to be ineffective. The elites in Kathmandu didn't listen to us. And so the Maoists claimed that they felt that the only option left available to them, the only way in order to get their issues on the agenda, was to turn to arms. So phase 2, the overt conflict between 1996 and 2006. Nepal experiences, as I mentioned, 10 years of violent insurgency that kills an estimated 17,000 people. And this conflict ends with only 19 days of civil resistance that paves the way for peace negotiations. Sorry, a typo, it should be under civil resistance strategies. We have these 19 days of mass protest and general strike that are made possible really by a coalition, by a deal that is struck between the major political parties in Nepal and the Maoist insurgents. They're forming alliance against the king. And in terms of peace building strategies, I think this was a really important part in eventually getting the Maoists and the political parties to strike an agreement that made it possible for them to work together. And that working together is what made possible this strategic change or tactical change from armed conflict to civil resistance. Another important element is that the Indian government played a heavy role in facilitating these efforts and these dialogues. The key negotiations that lead to both the alliance, and kind of a written document talking about kind of what the shared goals are of the Maoists and the political parties, as well as kind of laying out a strategy that was based off of based on tactics of civil resistance, nonviolent means. All those meetings and discussions are happening in Delhi. The impact. The king agrees to restore parliamentary democracy, and the political parties agreed to negotiate with the Maoists to construct a permanent settlement that would end the civil war. That civil resistance campaign in 2006 is known by kind of two different names, Loktandra Andolan, or Democracy Movement, or sometimes referred to as the Jana Andolan II, or the Second People's Movement, a reference to the 1990 movement that preceded it 16 years earlier. And so this ushers in phase 3, the conflict settlement. So during this phase, we have several months of negotiations between the Maoists and the political parties that lead to a comprehensive peace agreement. In addition, I should say, kind of beyond this, between 2006 and 2008, we then kind of have an interim government that is continuing to have negotiations over the structure of elections that will be held in 2008. Those are elections that will form a constituent assembly that will write a new constitution for Nepal. And part of these deliberations are as well as the future of the role of the monarchy in Nepal. What powers, if any, will the king have? We see some use of popular pressure in this phase. That is, actors taking to the streets using strikes and protest tactics when negotiations are reaching an impasse. But I wouldn't say that was the primary strategy during this phase. The main thing that we conclude is going on is that the Maoists are basically using the threat that they might return to the hills, return to violence, as leverage in their negotiations with the political parties. In terms of peace-building strategies, the dialogue was focused primarily on political next steps rather than long-term solutions to underlying social and political grievances. There was definitely kind of top-level statements of principle that Nepal needed to be moving in the direction of a more multi-ethnic and inclusive society. But a lot of the key kind of specific political issues, what this will mean in practice, are delayed towards later steps in the process. And the most controversial of these is how what kind of federal system will be created in Nepal, how power will be devolved from the central government to local political units, as well as kind of the geography. To what degree will those local units align geographically with the different with the demographics of the different ethnic groups that live around the country? To what degree will these different units look like states that are controlled by the particular identity groups that live in those regions? And so a lot of those things are punted off for later points in time. The advantage of that is it helps kind of facilitate, allows this pretty quick process between the end of the civil resistance campaign and the signing of the comprehensive peace agreement later in the same year, in November of 2006. However, it means that there are a lot of things lurking in the shadows waiting to rear their heads for the next phase, the post-conflict phase, the post-settlement phase. So here's a famous photo of the signing of the peace treaty. GP Korala is on the left. He is the head of the Nepali Congress Party and the Prime Minister of Nepal at this time. This is late 2006. And on the right is Pushpa Kamal Dahal, better known by his nom de guerre Prachanda. He was the leader of the Maoist rebel movement and goes on to be the leader of the Maoist political party. And here's a picture of continued protests that go on during the post-settlement period. Which brings us to our discussion of the post-settlement period. Despite the fact that we had this relatively successful transition in the settlement phase, a quick agreement on a comprehensive peace agreement, and a relatively orderly and straightforward transition to elections that are held in 2008, in which the Maoists run away with those elections. Comrade Prachanda, the Maoist leader, becomes the elected prime minister of Nepal in 2008. But it'll be another 7 years before the elected constituent assembly is able to actually write a constitution and pass a constitution. And so we have this long period of political instability in Nepal over the next 7 years, as the actors are unable to agree on a lot of those kind of thorny institutional issues that I talked about before. As they're having these debates, as they're not able to get the number of votes that they need in the Constituent Assembly to actually pass a constitution, the actors, especially those representing historically disadvantaged and marginalized groups, are frequently turning to nonviolent mobilization in order to draw greater attention to their cause and try to put pressure on the Constituent Assembly to pass a constitution in line with what they are demanding. So we have, in terms of civil resistance strategies, all actors are frequently turning to protest and strike tactics as a way of gaining leverage in political negotiation. And we find that this actually creates a backlash against marginalized groups in Nepal, that develops a sense of kind of social fatigue over what feels like constant protests, constant general strikes going on. Such that what starts as potentially sympathy for the agenda of these groups turns into resentment. In terms of peace-building strategies, we have continued efforts at dialogue, both in Parliament as well as in communities, out in communities, that is supported by substantial international assistance. A deluge of international programs and dollars in the post-settlement period, trying to implement any number of peace-building programs to foster social harmony and inclusion around the country. The international community is therefore accused by Nepali elites of kind of fomenting conflict, of providing support and cover for these marginalized communities that, as the society is becoming more and more resentful of the mobilization by marginalized communities, one of the things that they're doing is pointing their finger at the international community and saying, international community, this is your fault. It's you coming in here with your ideas about rights for marginalized communities and all of this funding and programmatic efforts trying to boost these communities. You're the ones who are creating all these protests all the time. You're disrupting the social fabric of Nepal. And so the impact, Nepal has experienced no return to civil war. And I think this is notable around the world. Conflicts that last as long as the one in Nepal did and that kill as many people, recurrence to civil war is a frequent endeavor. But we have not seen that in Nepal. In that sense, the settlement and post-settlement period have been a success. However, we had this long period of political and social instability. A constitution is eventually passed in 2015, I believe it is. Subindra, correct me if I've got the date wrong. And that resolves some issues, but there are many groups who are unsatisfied with the way that the constitution turned out and continue to use a variety of tactics to try to make changes and advance their agendas. The most notable of this was protest occurred in the immediate aftermath of the passage of the Constitution by groups that live in the plains area along the Indian border, who were upset that the way that the federal districts were divided did not give them were not in the shape that they wanted, did not give them a kind of single state in which they believed that they would have the majority and be able to implement the policies that they wanted. So this resulted in a substantial protest movement with some support from the Indian government that resulted in a blockade of fuel shipments into Nepal. If you lived in Nepal at this time, it was really difficult to get fuel, waiting for hours and hours and hours, if not days, in lines at gas stations to fill up your tank. And this created even greater resentment. Eventually, India backed down and stopped supporting the protesters, and the protest movement fizzled out. We have also, in recent years, seen some factions turn once again to violence. In 2019, an offshoot of the Maoist party, known as the Chan faction, engaged in some bombings in Kathmandu that killed, Subindra's gonna have to correct me on the numbers, I think it was between 2 and 4 people. So the lessons, I think Professor Didwe's framework is especially helpful in thinking through the period of latent conflict and how it led to violence in Nepal. Moreover, the Nepal Civil Resistance Campaign, I think, is a textbook example of a combination of how civil resistance and peacebuilding can work together to create what she terms constructive conflict. That is, without the Civil Resistance Campaign that kind of changed the balance of power between actors, many of the issues of social inclusion that marginalized communities were advocating for never would have been put on the agenda. However, it took these peacebuilding strategies to move from the Civil Resistance Campaign in April to getting a comprehensive peace agreement, as well as the institutional systems in place that allowed for elections and the Constituent Assembly. And so I think this is a really interesting model because it suggests that in violent conflicts, perhaps a transition to civil resistance can be an alternative goal for peace builders rather than trying to move straight from move straight to trying to foster a peace agreement, especially when the less powerful actors feel that any terms for such a peace agreement would not meet their core needs. However, there are some mixed lessons from the conflict settlement and post-settlement phases. I think the kind of defining characteristic of the conflict settlement period here was the fact that a lot of these political details of what the future political system would look like were punted to a later part in the process. And this was really helpful in that it allowed for an expedited agreement, allowed for a quick deal in late 2006. That probably saved lives. If that conflict had returned to violence, who knows what would have happened, how many more people would have died, how much longer it would have been. However, it has also resulted in a very contentious post-settlement phase where many of these same issues weren't really resolved during the conflict settlement and have continued to play out in a mix of mostly institutional, but a lot of civil resistance, protest, and strike type tactics, and even some violent tactics as well. So that concludes my presentation on our report, and I look forward to Dr. Veronique Didwe's comments, as well as your comments and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Ches. Before I go and introduce Veronique, Subindra, would you like to add anything to what Ches just presented at this moment?
Thank you. I think Ches said everything, only 2 points. One point is join party. Now they have come to the mainstream political party. So we didn't have any violent group at the moment in Nepal. And second thing, there's certainly, as we said, heavy involvement of India in Nepal's peace process, but we Nepalese take pride in saying that it is Nepal's peace process or civil resistance is very unique. We Nepali led it, so there is no involvement of international community. That's what we say. So there's a kind of, we take a pride. At the same time, there's a heavy involvement during the negotiation process by India and at the latter stage as well. But we think it's a very unique and it's a Nepal led. And rest, I think I'll come to the comment later. Thank you, Jade, and thank you much.
Thank you, Subindra. So I will now introduce our discussant, Veronique Didwe. Dr. Veronique Didwe is a senior research advisor at Berkel Foundation in Berlin, in Germany. Since 2005, she has managed various collaborative research projects on non-state armed groups, inclusive peace processes, negotiation, mediation, post-war political and security transitions, protest movements, and non-violent transitions of power. She conducts regular policy and peer-to-peer advice and training seminars for and with conflict and peace-building stakeholders. She is the author of already mentioned by Ches special ICNC special report, Powering to Peace, Integrated Civil Resistance and Peace-Building Strategies, published in 2017. She holds an MA and PhD in conflict resolution from the University of Bradford, UK. Veronique, it's a pleasure to host you here, and I would like to ask you to go ahead with your reflection.
Thanks, Maciej, and hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. It's a pleasure and honor to be able to comment on this great report on Nepal. So I would like to offer maybe a few thoughts about the framework itself, and then some comments on the report that has just been presented on Nepal, and what I find as the main added values, I would say, of this analysis in terms of helping to improve and to question some of the elements of this model. Maybe just to start with a disclaimer, I've heard a couple of times the Powering to Peace framework being called the Didwe framework, and here I'd like to really pay tribute and justice to all of those that have actually developed those thoughts right before me, all the way back to the early 1970s, when Adam Cole introduced this framework that I helped to repopularize, I guess, through this research, but others have worked on it, including John Paul Lederach and Diana Francis and so forth. So I think the way that this framework came together is that I would say over the last 15 years, I've been working in both worlds of civil resistance and peace building, as a scholar as well as an activist. And I became increasingly frustrated by what I saw as siloed approaches or communities that did not really work with one another. But I felt that actually those two communities very much needed each other's approaches. They were helping to fill each other's gaps. I would say that as in the many conflicts where I've worked as a researcher or as a trainer or as a practitioner, I found that there's times and there's moments and there's places when constructive conflicts need to be escalated, and then there's moments and times and places where conflict needs to be mitigated and de-escalated. And so this framework was very much motivated by the search for looking at ways through which civil resistance techniques on the one hand, and many examples of those techniques have been given in this report on Nepal, including demonstrations and strikes and so forth, as well as more constructive forms of resistance. And on the other hand, peace building techniques such as dialogue, negotiation, mediation, reconciliation, or institution building, how those tools and approaches can complement one another in those different stages of conflict transformation. And I would see conflict transformation as the bigger umbrella to which they both belong. So on the one hand, as has been presented, civil resistance strategies offer means of equalizing power relations in hugely asymmetric conflict. They also help to push for transformative change, for democratic reforms, and they can also be used to enforce implementation of negotiated settlements, which I would say peace building approaches lack. On the other hand, peace building methods provide tools to mitigate conflict, to de-escalate antagonized relationships, to achieve negotiated settlements through dialogue and negotiation, and to secure justice, reconciliation, and institutionalization of the gains that have been made through civil resistance and through negotiated settlements. This conversation has evolved a lot in the last couple of years. So since the publication of the report in 2017, there's been a lot of conversations, and I've been very happy to see those. Colleagues at ICNC, but also at the US Institute of Peace, for instance, have been very much instrumental in making those conversations happen. We've had joint sessions around the interface between civil resistance and peace building in places such as the Geneva Peace Week or the PeaceCon conference with the Alliance for Peace Building, also tomorrow at the Berlin-based Peace Building Forum. So I'm very happy that these conversations are happening, and maybe some of you might also be interested in the training guide that USIP has developed called Synergizing Nonviolent Action and Peace Building, SNAP, which is partly derived from the framework that was published by the ICNC in 2017. Turning to Nepal, I think the case of Nepal is a really good case study to illustrate and to test this framework of complementarity. It fits the four phases of conflict quite well, and the way that Chess has presented it shows that indeed in Nepal one found relevance of the latent, the overt conflict phases, as well as the settlement and post-settlement stages. And this case illustrates the respective contributions that nonviolent action and peace building can make in all of those stages, but also it helps to illustrate the fact that some of the promises of this complementary approach did not get realized. And what I really like about the report is that it tries to understand why did that promise not get realized, what were the gaps and what were the challenges. So just a few ideas that I have picked up while reading the report. So on the one hand, the Nepal case study shows that nonviolent revolutions can complement conflict resolution approaches such as dialogue and negotiation in conflicts that are hugely asymmetric. And as Chess has said, 19 days of civil resistance achieved what 10 years of armed struggle did not achieve. And I very much like the lesson of saying how peace-building practitioners should take nonviolent action and civil resistance more seriously, and that sometimes those techniques might be needed to equalize power relationships before a negotiation happens. I found the case of Nepal also shows how nonviolent action remains very important during negotiations. So the Madhesi movements, in particular during the constitutional negotiations, were instrumental in pushing for a federal system being applied in Nepal. But also what I found interesting in the report is that it shows that civil resistance tactics can actually become counterproductive, especially when they were used after 2006. They had sometimes the effect of exacerbating social divisions. they were seen and described as disturbances, especially by the majority or the elites, who could instrumentalize those protests by describing them as riots, subverting democratic processes, because now there is a democracy happening, so why is there a need for sustained nonviolent protests? Also, yeah, they are commenting that maybe general strikes have been used too often and might have been too aggressive as a method or as a tactical choice, and other methods could have been used. And I found it really interesting how in Nepal, there were 3 moments of civil resistance. The first one in 1990 that was dominated by elites, and when minority groups were not part of those protests. In 2006, they were much more inclusive and all strands of society were part of those protests. And then later on, civil resistance methods were used by minority groups, but did not gain allies and did not manage to reach the majority and the elites, and they become exclusionary again. And I find that really interesting. Maybe the last 2 points to stress before going into the Q&A. I find very interesting how the report showcases the importance of coalition building, and in 2005 and 6, how grassroots protest movements and civil society joined forces with the established opposition, the political and the armed opposition, to wage a successful campaign, and how this broader alliance building and coalition building, as I just said, was missing in later stages, and which also partly explains their failure. And finally, I think what Subindra just showed about the international community with the example of India is that how, on the one hand, international actors such as India can play a positive role by helping those coalition building to be formed in the first place, but later on, how the role of outsiders like India can be seen as fomenting protests and disrupting the peace, and therefore portrayed in a much more negative picture by the majority of citizens in Nepal. And so it shows the ambivalence of external support in a really interesting way. So I'll stop here. I hope I didn't speak too long, and I look forward to the Q&A session now.
Thank you, Veronique. Let's bring Ches and Subindra. If you can switch on your mics and cameras, that would be great. So first of all, I wanted to ask you whether you would like to respond right now to some things that Veronique brought up in her reflection, or you would like to go to Q&A.
I'll say just 2 very quick things. Thank you for that really insightful comments. And yeah, we framed this line about 19 days of civil resistance achieved what 10 years of civil war could not. And you talked about the importance of civil resistance as balancing the power dynamics. You know, another way of phrasing or thinking about that might be that 19 days of civil resistance also achieved what 5 years of traditional peace talks were not able to achieve, because there was this power asymmetry that created no overlap in the interest set of the 2 actors. And it wasn't until the civil resistance campaign kind of changed that distribution of power that you're able to have the conflict settlement process afterwards succeed to the degree it did, even though we identify some potential faults with it. And then I think, I'm really intrigued by this question of what can marginalized communities do in a situation that they found themselves in Nepal post 2008, when they no longer have allies to turn to, when they're faced with this choice between mobilizing and that mobilization potentially causing backlash, or accepting a status quo in which their goals and interests are not achieved. What is the toolkit available for them in that circumstances? What are the different choices they could make? I think it's a really important, interesting question for future research and advocacy work.
One point from my side, as Veronique said, in 2005 or 6, India had a heavy involvement in Nepal, and most of the outsiders also thought the peace process was led by India, and Nepali political leaders or the stakeholders had no role. But in 2015, when Nepal tried to promulgate the constitution, India tried to stop it. But again, what we Nepalese did, we passed it. So even though India had heavy hand, there's a Nepal. It was kind of Nepali led, and Nepal did what it wanted. So Nepal, from the very beginning in the peace process, in peace building issues, Nepal, I think, did what it wanted, despite India wanting it or not wanting it. And in the civil resistance part, I think it was a pure Nepali sort of thing. And as Veronique said, for the different ethnic groups, I think there was no allies because, as Chase pointed out earlier, because in so many parts of the state organs, civil society, media, the different marginalized groups or the ethnic groups do not have the voice, or they are not the ones who lead over there. So if they are having this movement, then media doesn't cover the way it covers if it was handled by if it was led by the elite groups. So it really matters who is in charge of different so civil society organs as well. So then that's how they don't get support, and their movement doesn't become successful as well. So I think it's not only about being marginalized, but it's also about being who is in Kathmandu, in different parts of the government and civil society hands as well. That's one point I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's move to Q&A, the way we do that is by asking participants to raise their hand if they would like to ask the question, and I will then unmute such person and ask to introduce yourself, and you can say your affiliation and then go ahead and ask your question. So right now, it's you can think about the question. You can also, if you are a shy person and you don't want to speak up, then you can also type your question in the question panel. And once we exhaust those who would like to ask the question live, we will then go to the questions that were written down. And while you are thinking about your question, I wanted to ask the speakers about one aspect, like a very interesting, although just one element that came out in your presentation when you were talking, Chess, about the post-conflict stage. It was interesting to see that civil resistance can also backfire. We talked about backfire in the context of civil resistance when the violence is used against non-violent resistors, and that backfires on those who use that violence, and then it propels or strengthens civil resistance. Here, in your report, both of you are talking about fatigue in the society because civil resistance was overused or abused in the post-conflict stage, which is an interesting I think phenomenon that has not really explored much in the literature. Jonathan Pinckney writes about the negative impact of what he refers to as a kind of street radicalism or maximalist kind of demands, and using this kind of street radical approach. So my question to you is, given this the presence of that fatigue about civil resistance, what should be civil resistors' strategies, in the post-conflict phase? We know that perhaps too little civil resistance could be also problematic. Here you are pointing out to the fact that too much of civil resistance could be as problematic and damaging for the kind of stability or successful transition. So where to find the balance when you think about what those who engaged previously in civil resistance, or those who are thinking about deploying nonviolent actions during that transition phase in the context of maybe ongoing instability and challenges. So how they should kind of balance this, given what you are discovering in Nepal case.
So Bindra, can I invite you to start on this? Because I feel like my experience of understanding this type of fatigue and backlash came a lot out of some of the conversations that we've had. I remember sitting in Subinder's car waiting to get gas, and it being what felt to me like a long time to wait of like 30 minutes or something, and Subinder laughing at me and be like, haha, you should have been here in 2015. I'll show you, that was a really long gas line. So I think if you could kind of shed some light, like what it was like to be a resident of Kathmandu during the period of time in which all of these bandas and protests are happening.
No, thank you. You know, this non-violent resistance later became kind of, the government started not liking it for two reasons. One is, as Chase or Veronique said earlier, so somehow the government thought, some of the marginalized group who were taking part in non-violent resistance, they were supported by the international community. So they thought it was not their original idea and it was supported by someone else. So why should we do what they are saying? So that's one thing. And second thing, what happened, what is happening in Nepal, I think it's all about the system. Then, unless and until you try to go for a strike, or, that's what we call banda, or you do something, or you become violent, the government doesn't listen to it, or government doesn't act on it. And that's how this became a problem. And that's the reason different certain groups started, taking that second route, that is going to the strike, rather than just, having this non-resistant movement, because the government was not listening to. What we started asking government or the political parties at that time is that they were the ones who took part 19 days civil resistance and brought the change in the country, and they were not listening to those who were doing the same thing. Let's say by different ethnic groups for their demands, even when there were kind of moral support from Kathmandu or Kathmandu press or even civil society, but they were still not listening. So, there's a kind of, I think, fatigue sort of thing is that, and for the government is that everyone was asking everything. So different sort of groups like, were asking so many things, and I think government was not in a position to agree. So if you look at, the data over here, I think about 47 or 48 times the government had negotiated. They have written, they have agreed in writing that we'll do this, do that for you. And people were then, they were breaking up that civil resistance movement. But again, when they came out from that movement, and government forgot what it agreed with the dissent group. So that continued continues until today. There's a, by health expert, the doctor called Govind Kesi, who has been staging this non-violent resistance movement for about 19 times or 20 times, and there has been already agreement with him so many times by the government. But they just signed the agreement and they don't do anything. That has been part of the, I think, the culture over here, agreeing to do something but not delivering. So that is how everything seems to have become so fatigued. I'm not sure whether I or I'm in my shades.
No, that's excellent. Veronique, have you seen this type of example of this fatigue with civil resistance in other cases that you may have looked in the context of your report or some additional research?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because when I wrote the original report in 2017, I actually point to Nepal as a positive example of sustained nonviolent mobilization after the agreement to push for the implementation of structural reforms, because what I had found until then was too many examples of demobilization after a political agreement or after a transition, with grassroots activists going to other sectors or moving into the government or moving into the organized civil society. And so that kind of watchdog function was lost. And I felt, okay, in Nepal, it seems that there's something interesting in there, in that groups continue to actually push for the most progressive elements to really be implemented. And so it's pictured in a very positive light. And then And then when I read the report, which is written by lived experiences from Nepal, right, rather than from my kind of external outlook into what I was looking into in there, it's a very different flavor. And so since then, I've also talked to a few activists from, for instance, Madishi activists, who are also giving me their own interpretations of that and explaining how maybe their failures to actually build broader alliances, the fact that those protests are very much fragmented by different identity groups, are also not helping them to be more effective. So no, to answer your question, Machi, I haven't really seen that elsewhere, because I think, as you were saying, there's very little research into post-peace agreement protests. So it's still very much of an uncharted territory, and I would love to see more research done to see whether that finding is also seen elsewhere.
Thank you. I will remind the audience that those of you who would like to ask the question live, you can raise your hand in the menu that you have on your computer or mobile device, and then I will unmute you. I will ask you to introduce yourself and ask your question. Meanwhile, I've got a question that was sent to us from Katja Weber, and she writes that it sounds like civil resistance and peace building strategies were very successful in Nepal. And she's wondering whether there are any type of conversations going on between some of the organizers of civil resistance in Nepal and activists, people in places like Myanmar, in order to share, best practices of what has been working well or what hasn't. Any of you who may have some thoughts on that, how the Nepalese kind of example and people that were part of both peace building and civil resistance strategies might be sharing right now knowledge, and in what way with those who engage in struggles elsewhere.
Okay, there have been some groups coming from Myanmar and different parts of the world coming to Nepal to learn from Nepal's peace process, especially not from civil resistance, but mostly from peace process, and on integration and reintegration as well. I also have the opportunity to work with a few groups who came from Myanmar to learn from Nepali stakeholders. It was in 2016 and 2018. So there are other people coming in from other parts of the world as well. There are some people coming from Sri Lanka as well. There are people coming from even Colombia as well, and also from Philippines as well. I think, and Veronique also know more about it.
Yeah. When I see what's been happening in Myanmar since the coup a couple of months ago, actually, it reminds me a lot of the 2006 situation in Nepal. Since in Myanmar, like the same thing has happened of armed groups basically going into a tactical or strategic alliance, let's say, with the democratic parties and grassroots activists, in a kind of tacit cooperation with, let's say, all of the ethnic armed organizations deciding to leave their weapons aside and to leave and to join a popular peaceful protest, basically. Even though I think now there's more and more calls for going back to the violent strategies, because it seems that the civil resistance movement is not making headway, and I find that very frustrating, because I would say they're doing everything right. So there's a huge coalition building across all of those sectors. There's a huge variety of tactics being used, and still the military junta is not moving. There's also a lot of international pressure. So when I'm thinking about the role of the peace building community in Myanmar, I would say is that when the moment is going to be ripe for going back to the negotiation table, and there's been negotiations going on for several years now in Myanmar, I think they will have to completely rethink the designs of those dialogue tables to really pay tribute to those nonviolent activists that have been so instrumental and so much at the forefront of pushing for change in the last couple of months, including youth and women, etc., which have been completely excluded from the negotiation table lately. So I'm hoping that when the moment for a peace building approach is going to be right again, then this thinking will kick in, and maybe trying to avoid the mistakes of Nepal, where all of those minority groups that were so instrumental in bringing the negotiations forward were excluded from the table and therefore had to resort to civil resistance afterwards to really push for their demands. So I'm hoping some learning can happen, and if there's no conversations happening right now between peace builders from Nepal and Myanmar, I'm really welcoming those, because I think they would be essential.
Thank you. So we've got another question that was sent to us that came from Karin Orr, and she thanks for the excellent presentation. And she is wondering about the role of women in the civil resistance movements or campaigns that you both wrote about, and whether what kind of agenda they had, both in the kind of civil resistance as well as in peace building engagements, and particularly she's inquiring about that because she knows many women were active as non-state armed actors during the Civil War. Then that's probably where her question comes. Then women were engaged in Civil War as armed actors. So then, what were their roles in civil resistance or peace building processes in Nepal? And Veronique, you could maybe then follow with maybe your reflection about the role of women generally in the campaigns that you are familiar with. So Ches, Subindra, maybe you could address first this question, and then maybe Veronique could refer to more kind of other cases, basically, to speak about the role of women in civil resistance and peace building.
Okay, I'll go first. During the Maoist movement, we're so surprised that there were so many women who took part in the insurgency, and it was really surprising for us to know about that. And then but if you look at the role of women in the peace process was lessened after they came out to the mainstream politics, or even before the mainstream politics, because there is only one woman leader who took part in the peace process. That was in 2005 or end of 2005, and again after 2006, there's only one leader from the Maoist Party who was involved in the peace process. So not that many women were involved, putting their rights. So that was seen even during the integration and rehabilitation of Maoist army combatants, where the women leaders were not there, and the needs of the women were not addressed, or at the time. So during the civil resistance movement as well, the involvement of women were pretty high, but the leaders, and all the people who came in media were Muslim men. So I think that question asked by Corinne is, I think, very important, because we have not missed. I mean, I have not looked civil resistance movement from the gender lens. So I'm sorry for that. So I really don't know much about it on this one.
I don't know if Ches, would you like to add anything on Nepal?
No, I think that's a perfect synopsis from Subindra. That I think one of the stories is that the Maoists first, and later the other political parties, have become adept at talking the talk of gender equality, raising those issues, and hence mobilizing women to their cause, while at the same time maintaining some very patriarchal structures within their organizations. Such that at the negotiating table, the women are welcome to the protest, but then not invited to the negotiating table. And one of the thorniest issues in the aftermath has been the issue of citizenship being passed down exclusively from fathers to children versus also from mothers to children, which overlaps with ethnic identity issues, because this is most salient to those communities who live on the border with India and have traveled back and forth. So yeah, extraordinarily important having major consequences on the aftermath.
Yeah, my own impressions from Nepal in particular is that there's a few women who are active in either the non-violent or the violent insurgencies that have made it to the top and who have played very strong roles in the Constitutional Assembly and in the Parliament now, and who are really raising women's voices and demands. But this is a tiny minority. I think the vast majority of female activists have been left behind, and their voices have not been heard, and they're still demanding that. I would say across the other contexts, I would maybe point to a piece of research that I've conducted with Jonathan Pinckney, which is being published hopefully later next month, which shows that in political transitions that emerge out of civil resistance campaigns, actually the presence of women in meaningful positions in those dialogue and negotiation spaces which follow the nonviolent revolution, having those women in those spaces actually has a huge impact on the longevity and the quality of democracy afterwards. We found a strongly significant statistical correlation, which echoes a lot of the research that was done in the civil war and conflict resolution literature on the importance of having women in peace building in the sense of negotiation spaces. So yeah, that's an interesting finding that I'll welcome you reading on and discussing in the future. And yeah, I think Nepal, as I said, is on the one hand a positive case for a few women really being strong and pushing for also quotas in the Constitutional Assembly and so forth. But then, yeah, the vast majority having been completely remarginalized after the conflict, even though they have forcefully been part of either the non-violent or the violent movements for change.
Thank you. That was great. Great responses. Yet another question, written question. It's concerning the marginalized groups that, despite protesting, they failed to get their needs addressed. The question comes from Deborah Parkesh, a PhD candidate, School of International Development, University of Ottawa, and she's wondering whether you could, Chair Subindra, if you can specify, those marginalized communities that basically didn't or failed to gain what they were asking, despite the fact that they were relying on civil resistance methods, and perhaps elaborate what were the limits of civil resistance in the context of those marginalized groups, and what might be the way forward for them.
Yeah, so I'll speak briefly and then allow Subindra to respond. We've highlighted these shortcomings and the degree to which many of the groups that advocate on behalf of these organizations have expressed when we talk with them dissatisfaction with the outcomes. At the same time, I don't want to write off the narrative of this transformation overall being successful. I think if you look at the position that these communities are in compared to before the, in the mid-90s, before the conflict, it is a pretty notable difference, and that there are many of their key pillars that they did see enshrined in the ultimate constitution. I think most of, nevertheless, there are some major outstanding issues, most of them, as I understand it, having to do with the geographies of federal districts, about whether they are drawn in such a way, similar to those listening who live in the United States, who have debates over gerrymandering. It's the same idea. Do you draw these new states to exist in Nepal in such a way that particular ethnic groups hold a majority within those boundaries, such that they are likely to have majorities in local politics and be able to enact policies that are consistent with what they think their groups want? Or do you draw are these states drawn in such a way that no single group has a majority, or that historically privileged groups are the ones that have the majority in most of the districts? And then beyond that, there are a number of kind of more social policy type issues, questions of quota representation in parliament, has been an area in which I think by and large, especially on gender, these communities have been successful. Other issues such as the birthright, citizenship passed through the mother. It's been interesting to update us. I'm not quite sure what the status of that is right now, but my understanding is at one point that was still an outstanding issue that many of these communities were mobilizing for.
Thank you. You know, in Nepal, we have more than 100 ethnic groups, and there are some of them are divided within certain geography, whereas some of them are divided in separate ways or mixed within the mixed groups. So, and they have, you know, and when the Maoist insurgency was on, then they started telling everyone that, you know, will provide you this sort of right if you join us, or if we became a victor, then we'll provide you this or that. We provide you ethnic federalism, federal state where you can be your own, chief minister, or you will have your own state. So all the promises were given to different ethnic groups. So, and then the government or whoever other political party came in power, they became suspicious, thinking that, then on these lines, then there were two sort of political arguments. One thought that, giving identity or rights to the different ethnic groups is a good way, whereas other thought that is that will disintegrate the country. So it became such an issue for so many years that people didn't have the, what we say is that rational view to look at those sort of issues. So it became really, really politicized, and then government or the media or civil society didn't have the same views on the same issue. So we are not being rational. So it took really long time on that one, and they also had no alliances, as we said in the past. But if you look at the women, then no one was, raising voices against them. Like, for example, at the quota system, if you look at the local level, now their representation is pretty high. For the Dalit women, there's so much high. But for the political sort of, access, the government and other political parties or whoever are in power, they try to be against that. So I think unless the issue is about political access or political privilege, then that seems to have become a problem. Otherwise, there is no problem. So I think, and if you look at it, as Chase earlier said, the federal state that we have at the moment, though we are a kind of federal country, still the central state holds the power, not letting the power to go into the different provinces or the local level. So I think the politics and power have not been good to make the whatever this civil rights stand for the ethnic groups or so many other groups. I'm sorry for my English, I didn't find the word, but I think that is not working anyway. Politics and power are the bad things, at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you. So we've got time for one more question, and I would like to unmute Michael Beer, who raised his hand. And Michael, please introduce yourself and go ahead with your question. You have to only unmute yourself on your end. Right now, I unmuted you. Michael, go ahead. And okay.
Yes,
Michael,
hi, thank you very much for this wonderful report. I had two questions. What are some of the substantive changes that we've really seen in the last 30 years that have really made a difference in people's lives? Or has this just been a struggle among elites and we've reshuffled the deck? And what role has human rights defense and that framework played in both the civil resistance and peace building components in Nepal?
thank you, Michael. So, any of you, please respond.
Okay, I think I'll go first. I didn't understand the second question properly, but I'll try to answer the first one. I think that's a very good question. That's we keep asking in Nepal too. Like, what have we got after 30 years of all these political, movements in every 10 years? And like we had a movement in 1990, then 1996 again, we had a movement in 2008 again, then again 2015. All the time, what we have been having is political movements, political strike all the time. But what we have got so far is, I think we have made such a stride in terms of political empowerment in Nepal. So what we keep saying nowadays is that we are done with political movement now. What we need to do is economic empowerment, economic development, because the political rights, we have got it. We have got enough for now. So, but only the political rights and political empowerment have not changed the life of the people who are at the margins. Though we have, created so many political leaders, like when Aung San Suu Kyi was in Nepal, and she had a meeting with our political leaders, and in which room we had like about 5 former prime ministers meet her, and she said that that was the first time she met so many prime ministers at one room. So that means, we have been creating so many political leaders, prime ministers in Nepal, but we haven't been able to change the quality or the lives of the poor people. So that is I think, very good question. And that is the kind of questions that we have been asking now and then in Nepal. So I think that's how I'd like to end the first question. I didn't understand the second question. Sorry for that.
Yeah, I'll just add to that in the first question. Yeah, I think you could kind of go through the list of 40 some odd grievances that the Maoists posted on the day of their first attacks in 1996, and check off what has been implemented versus not. And there's a reasonable number that would be implemented, whether it's just going to broad state policies in terms of how it defines itself in a more inclusive way, to some of the things that Veronique and Subhitra have talked about in terms of the actual demographic composition of the parliament today versus what it was in the 1990s is very different. I remember one of the things that struck me when I was doing research in some of the base areas for where the insurgency started was the cranes everywhere, road construction projects, that I think that there is kind of a direct relationship between gaining access to political participation, and then through kind of probably patronage politics that resulting in appropriations and investment projects back home in those districts and for those communities that now have greater representation in Kathmandu. In terms of human rights, again, please feel free to intervene if I'm misunderstanding the question. I think it's a really interesting word in Nepal because different groups have interpreted it in different ways. There was, in that early 1990s period, those who interpreted it in kind of a Western liberal tradition of human rights and saw themselves as advocates for human rights, creating NGOs, really with kind of democracy, open media, kind of as the focus of what that term meant, and with perhaps not focusing on what that term meant in terms of thinking about social inequality. The Maoists kind of bring those ideas to the fore, though I think that they were hesitant and less likely to tap into the terminology and the use of human rights. I remember someone I was interviewing asking me whether the right to development was a human right. And I feel like that kind of captures the more modern, the more contemporary place where activist minds are at in Nepal in terms of seeing development as a primary goal, and therefore seeing the human rights construct as useful to them to the degree to which it becomes a moral justificatory basis for advancing development policies.
Yeah, I was also struck in Nepal how I've seen lots of actually clashes of approaches between those activists focusing on individual rights for women or civil and political rights, and those marginalized groups asking about collective identity-based rights. And so everyone comes with their own interpretation of whose rights should come first. And I would say the 2006 revolution was a meeting of all of those rights coming together, and then kind of yeah, this unity of purpose being lost again afterwards. But I remember, Michael, like when I drafted the report in 2017, you also had some really good points about where would human rights defenders and the human rights community come into this framework? Are they more on the civil resistance side? Are they more on the peace building side? And I was struggling actually with this question. I mean, I see human rights very much on the side of civil resistance, but of course, peace builders would say they are also very much fighting and advocacy for human rights. And so when I commented on the first draft of the Nepal case study, I was also asking that same question. So I don't know whether it's been taken up by the authors, but it's definitely a good point, which also points at, you know, some of the limitations of having very neat, clearly delineated categories where lots of tactics and approaches are actually blurring those boundaries.
I should add one thing that we haven't talked about yet today that falls within the bounds of human rights, but also gender rights, is transitional justice, which has been a major outstanding grievance in the Nepal context. That constantly, when it's been a thorny political issue, and it's always been the one to just be ignored and punted for the sake of expediency of striking the next agreement.
Great. That was excellent, guys. I think we had a very interesting conversation here, including very challenging questions, but you met those challenges very well. So we exhausted our time for the webinar, and I would like to very much thank our speakers and the discussant. Perhaps each of you would like to say a final word and a kind of final reflection, a brief one, before we will conclude the webinar.
Maybe from my side, an invitation again to read the report and to come back in a couple of weeks when there's going to be the next discussion on the Liberia case study, which I think also brings into light some different elements of the pros and cons of this framework. So yeah, thanks for the invitation. I mean, it's such a privilege to be able to have fully fledged case studies by distinguished scholars being using one's framework. I mean, that's a once in a lifetime chance. So thanks to the ICNC for having made that possible.
Thank you. And just a reminder, everyone can download Chess and Subindra report from ICNC website for free. If you would like to order a hard copy, you can do that through Amazon, for which you will pay probably like $5 or $6. So if this is an issue, again, you can download electronic copy for free. And we have recorded that webinar, so we will be sending a link of that webinar to everyone who registered for that. And I didn't have a chance to go through all the questions. We had some additional questions that were asked, but we ran out of time. So I will send those questions. We'll send those questions to our guests and ask them to respond in writing, and we'll post the answers also on the webinar page where the recording of the webinar will be posted. So once again, I would like to thank everyone and thank our guest speakers and the respondent, and wish everyone a great day and stay safe and well. Thank you.